This session is Leviathan, Command and Control Communications on Planet Earth with Kenneth Gears and Kevin Thompson. So, Joan.
Hello, everybody here okay? So the idea for this presentation is strategic analysis. It's traffic analysis. It's a very high level. And so the whole point is to step back and look at millions of communications, not 1 or 10 or 1,000 even. So FireEye is in the lucky place now that it really has access to a lot of data. So we asked to look at 18 months worth of data. And these are malware callbacks, so about 30 million malware callbacks over 18 months. Now there's only 1 million or so of those that are unique. A lot of them are beacons that go on and on. However, what it is a huge data set. And it goes back to 208 countries and territories around the world. From thousands of our sensors and clients all over the world. And so my colleague Kevin is more technical and looks at more individual aspects of malware callbacks, and I'm an analyst, so I just look at the big picture. I just moved to Ukraine a couple weeks ago, so if anybody's watching the news out there and Russia invades, just please raise your hand and let me know. I'd appreciate it. But so anyway, I'm now 2501, ex-FireEye, but Kevin is FireEye. But all this data and all of this insight is definitely FireEye. Kevin?
Yeah. So good morning again. Thanks for presenting. This is my first presentation at Black Hat. We were talking yesterday about this being Ken's 10th anniversary of his presentation. So we get sort of both ends of the spectrum. So we really appreciate you coming and making this presentation. So again, a threat analyst for FireEye, working there about 1.5 years, talking about what the threats are to all of our customers and what we're seeing worldwide. Before that, I was in the government for 6 years as a cyber analyst. What are the threats to the U.S. government? So really able to see both sides of the spectrum of what we're seeing from a public sector attacks and then also what we're seeing from a private sector attacks. So, and Ken, do you want to give your background a bit?
Yes, I was 20 years in government, just a little over a year with FireEye, and now I live in Ukraine, so I'm going to do my own thing, along doing analysis and writing. So the idea for the presentation, not only is these malware callbacks, a whole lot of them, but can you click the slide, is the idea that this is going to be a very difficult problem for governments to solve. So Leviathan actually is a word that means whale or sea monster. And so the worldwide malware problem that we currently face is going to be very difficult to solve. And the question also I want to put in your minds is, do even governments want to solve this problem? The reason I say that is because I think governments today probably benefit quite a lot from defending their sovereignty as well as projecting national power via the internet. And so a lot of that is computer network operations that are in fact hacking, right? Or denial of service attacks that are meant to achieve some tactical national objective.
So the idea that we've all heard is about terrorism chatter. So we hear it from politicians, you hear it from the media, you hear it from intelligence folks. Sort of this idea of there's an increase in chatter, there's an increase of communication. We're not really sure what that communication is or maybe who's talking about it, but you see an increase in chatter so you have a good understanding that something is going on. There's also the idea that some of the journalists in Washington, D.C. would pay attention to both the White House and the Pentagon and see if there was late night pizza trucks coming or if there was late night fast food being delivered to the Pentagon or to the White House. They knew that there was something going on there. They couldn't tell exactly what was going on, but they knew by some of those context clues that something was going on. So our idea was we had access to all these, 20, 30 million different unique callbacks coming from, victims over to their command and control. We thought, well, what if we did the same thing? What if we looked at this on a large scale? And what if are we able to see something? Like we know there's smoke over here, or maybe be able to tell something going on between two countries or two areas solely by looking at the first stage callback. So the roadmap for this is really the first section is going to cover the what, and the second section will really cover the why. So I'll talk about what are we talking about when we mean our data and where we're getting it from and the importance of getting that data, and then also what we're referring to when we're looking at a callback, and then I'll sort of take both a high level and a deep dive on looking at these 20 to 30 million different callbacks. What are some of the trends we see specific towards industries? What are some of the trends we see specifically about a piece of malware? How are these different from the different types of callbacks? Where are they going from, coming from? Where are they going to? And then Ken's going to take that same data, that same 20 to 30 million callbacks, and put that over sort of a geopolitical landscape and what's going on with the world. And let's take a look at these callbacks, and can we see any events, current events or future events that are happening solely by looking at callbacks? Now, we're really keen, and we understand, and we've heard the critique about, well, you should really focus on first stage callbacks when malware's calling out somewhere, because that's not the end result, or that's not where the attackers are sitting, or that's not where the data is going. So we've heard a lot of that critique about that. But what we're trying to say is that you can't just immediately discount it because it might not be exactly where it's going on. So we'll talk about communications that stay within country and that communications that move outside of country. But we really understand that this is not the end point of where the malware is going, but we think with such a large data set, you can still get some understanding of what the attackers are doing and how they're moving this data worldwide. So the best way that we thought that we could sort of highlight how difficult and how big of a worldwide problem this is we took all the callbacks that we were looking at. So again, the 20 to 30 million different callbacks, and we put them on a world map of where they were going to. And we wanted to increase the size by the circle of where the increased amount of callbacks, where they were going to, and make that circle bigger. So you can see when we laid it on a map, we were really surprised that, we sort of have this assumption that everything goes either to the US or Russia or China. But when we laid it on a map on where these callbacks were going to from a lot of our customers, we saw that it was just about every country and every place in the world. We saw, I think it was over 200 different countries and provinces and area within the world that was, not what you would assume is just the major places that malware is going to. And one of the things that this really struck us when we saw this on a map is it really amplifies how difficult a problem this is for a law enforcement perspective. You have different jurisdictions. You also have different countries that may not work well together. So trying to solve this problem and trying to stop this from a law enforcement perspective, seeing information like this on a map really makes it difficult to sort of get a handle on this problem. So the data itself that we're taking, again, it's about 20 to 30 million different pieces of callback, around 600,000 to 700,000 unique ones. But I don't really want to get caught up on the numbers. The interesting thing about this, there's two interesting points. The first one is the data that we're using is not from home users. So these are all businesses and these are all government. So these are what businesses and government are facing on a daily basis. And the callbacks and information that we got were not from reverse engineering a piece of malware. We're looking at a DGA piece of malware, and these are all the different possible callbacks that it could go to, or these are the other places that a different malware piece can call to. These are actually pieces of malware that we had seen, and they're actually where they're calling out to. And the way that where FireEye sits for the most part, the data that we're getting is we're usually sitting after firewall, after IPS, after IDS. So that's why I didn't want to focus too much on the numbers, because you could probably get bigger numbers just sitting on a DMZ and something. But we wanted to sort of focus. These are almost the last line of defense data that we're seeing from our customers that were from both the private sector and as well as governments around the world. So the first thing we did is just break down the different pieces of malware and look, okay, so how big of a callback problem are each one of these malware are calling back? So we took each one, and again, the size of the circle really highlights how much unique communication each one of these pieces of malware has. So when you look at this from sort of a network perspective angle, these are sort of the things that people have to deal with on a daily basis. You see some of these pieces of malware, both advanced and your run-of-the-mill, everyday, commoditized piece of malware. The amount of traffic that we're seeing from these is just huge when you break it down per individual piece of malware. So callbacks and communication, just sort of a quick overview of what we're talking about. So obviously, box get infected, it sends that data over to a server or a spot that's hosted by the attackers. So the important thing about a lot of the callbacks is there's a lot of information about that victims that we're seeing in the callbacks. And they vary from piece of malware. Some of them are encoded, some of them are encryption, but they have things like, is there a webcam attached to them? What sort of antivirus are they using? What sort of security tools are included onto the victim's box. But for the presentation, we really wanted to focus solely on not sort of that other information that comes along with what a victim has, but solely where are they going to? So what sort of domain names are they using? And then where in the world are they going to? So there's a lot of information you can get just solely by looking at callbacks, regardless if it's a stage 1 or stage 2. But we really wanted to focus on where they were going. So the first thing we did was we broke it down by industry. We wanted to see, is one industry sending out more unique callbacks than another industry? So again, we broke it out by industry and then put it, the size of each circle is how many unique callbacks we're seeing from each one of those industries. And education, both in 2013 and in 2014, was by far the largest one that was sending out unique callbacks. Open networks, more of a sharing atmosphere, not as concerned about where their information is going, but education by far is number one. The tech sector, healthcare and government sort of taking up 2, 3, and 4. The interesting thing is when you look from 2013 to 2014, at the tail end of 2013, the financial sector was really starting to increase in the amount of callbacks, unique callbacks that we had seen. And the early part of 2014, the healthcare industry had really sort of caught up in the amount of unique callbacks that we had seen from each one of the sectors. So it was interesting to watch this over an extended period of time to see how different industries, how they increase or decrease as malware changes and as defense changes. So we also did sort of the ebb and flow of, on a 2014 first couple of months, how is this traffic going? Are we seeing an increase? Are we seeing a decrease? And then broken down by each one of the industries, for the most part, there was sort of a steady increase leading all the way up through the first couple of months in 2014. A little small bump towards the end of May, but we're still seeing a steady increase from 2014, from the beginning of the year until now, on the number of unique callbacks that we're seeing from each one of these industries. So the next thing that we wanted to look at is, it'd be interesting to look at port numbers, sort of, challenge our assumptions of, everyone assumes at this point malware, a lot of it's calling out over port 80 or it's calling over 443 or something. So we took all the different pieces of malware that we saw and put it out in just port number, just curiosity where they're going from. So we saw over 33,000 different port numbers that were used to send this command and control information out there. And obviously port 80 was by far the highest port that we saw command and control information leaving. But what I thought was interesting about this is you see on that the sort of the second highest bar is in the 15 to 16K port numbers. And the interesting thing about that is for us that really highlighted the fact on how big of a problem zero access malware was that was using sort of these ports, that you could see how large of a spike from all the industry, government, and private sector customers that really had to deal with this. So when we look at it sort of on a port by port basis on all the callbacks, we really were able to see some interesting information about types of malware calling out. And then when we looked at who was the verticals or the industries that sent out the most callbacks, we also wanted to look at, so where are these callbacks going? What sort of interesting things that we see? We assume everything's going to like some random generated name.org. What we did is we saw that there was a handful of command and control callbacks that were actually going to universities around the world. So we took that one step deeper and said, okay, these command and controls that are going to universities and going to .edus, we wanted to break it down by department. Say, hey, is one department getting more of this malware callbacks than some of the other departments? And when we broke it down by department, we saw that for the most part, the library of a lot of these educations is by far receiving the most. After that, the computer science department is receiving them, and then lastly, the School of Law was receiving them. So it was interesting to sort of break it down to see not only were these callbacks going to universities, but what sections of the university were they going to. And then we also wanted to look at, were any of them going to government networks, .govs, and also some IP addresses that were assigned to governments. And what we did is we saw that there was over 20 different countries that had governments receiving command and control communication. Again, this is not the assumption that they're the hackers, or that someone had hacked in and maybe used their domains, but we saw 20 different countries that were receiving command and control communications. And by far, South America was by far the largest area that was receiving command and control communications going to government areas, followed up after that by Asia. We also want to look, well, how often does malware call back to the same country that the victim is in? We would think that they would want to stay in the same country to sort of hide in the noise. If you're a network admin, you're looking at traffic going to Russia or China, obviously that raises a little bit more of a red flag than if it's in your country. So what we saw is when we looked at these, 20 to 30 million different ones, roughly around 20% of the callbacks were staying within the same country that the victim was in. So if they were in, Brazil, 20%, overall we're sending back to that same country. And when we broke it down to the United States, around 15 to 16% of all those callbacks, the first stage of them were staying within the United States. So they weren't directly going to Russia, they weren't directly going to China. And then we wanted to look at, well, is one piece of malware or what people would consider an advanced piece of malware, is that called back more often or is that called back less often? So when we looked at for 2013, the things that we would consider like an APT type attack. Now, we could probably have a 6-month conference on what an APT is, but so what the ones that we were considering for the sake of this argument, APT, we saw in 2013, they were calling back half as much as some of the traditional or commoditized malware. Again, follows suit that they want to stay a little bit more hidden. They don't want to make as much noise. But for 2014, the first 5 or 6 months that we had seen and used some of this data, we're seeing that they're calling out 7 times less than some of the commoditized malware and that traditional malware, which again goes to the fact that they're trying to stay hidden and not trying to be overly loud and overly obnoxious. So then digging again into a little bit of where the callbacks are going to, we wanted to kind of look at what interesting domain names are we using, sort of hiding in the noise and anything interesting that we could find. So when we started looking through this, we saw around 200 different variations of Google. So things like, using the Q instead of the G, using the 0 instead of the O, just, 200 different variations of trying to spoof that domain. And then over 200 of one similar that we're trying to use Firefox, changing this letter, changing that letter, adding another word to it. 50 different variations of Facebook, adding an A instead of an O, switching back and forth. Hundreds of different variations of Microsoft, a lot of them just spelling, just changing 1 or 2 letters around, changing Windows things around. And then a handful of spoof security or AV companies as well, changing 1 or 2 letters, moving things around, making it look like it's an update. But we thought it was interesting when we really started to dive into to see the amount of spoof sort of domains that we see on these initial stage callbacks. When we're working a little bit with some of our other groups and our other researchers, we also found out there's a couple of cases where we saw domain names that were actually used as the company that they were leaving from. So the victim was calling out to a domain name that either had the name of the company or the project that the company was working on, including in that callback. Again, a prime opportunity to sort of hide in, thinking, oh, maybe marketing or maybe sales set up a website. I won't jump out. So the last thing we did is we want to take all these different domain names and put a word cloud in here. What sort of words are we seeing that? And obviously the size is what we saw in some of the domains. And you see some ones that are tied to specific pieces of malware, stripped there, your nailed sort of things. But we also saw things like honeypot, report, security, secure, AV, those sorts of things, and an increase in sort of traffic noise to, again, hide between the noise. So what? So why is this important? There's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of information. As my favorite philosopher says, statistics can prove anything. 40% of people know that. So what's like the reason for having this data? What sort of information can we get from having this mass amount of data? So what Ken did is a lot of this analysis was taking that same amount of huge number of callbacks and putting that over sort of a geopolitical landscape and came up with some of the interesting information.
So this is all of our data on one network map. And it's kind of a heat map as well, in that the color and size of the node will highlight the relative importance or the centrality of the node in the network map. And I know this is really small, so I'm going to blow it up for you, but just on the right side, you can see that there's the US, Korea, Canada, some of the central nodes in cyberspace. Of course, they're also going to be the central nodes within the world's malware ecosystem. And some of on the far right, you can see these are even some unique countries that even in 30 million callbacks, we only saw them reporting back to the United States. And so those are some obscure networks. This is a heat map that highlights what's called the in degree for each node. And so the relative importance of the inward-facing arrows, which means the homes of C2 servers become more important in the network map. So here, from the left to the right, you can see Turkey, Netherlands, Poland, France, Russia gets a darker color. And Czech Republic over to Taiwan. And so here, it's a network map that's chiefly showing you, where the callbacks are going. And again, these are from clients all over the world, thousands and even millions of communications. And you can see the United States up on the top right still dominates the map in terms of size and color, and is really not only in the middle of internet traffic, generally speaking, but is also, not surprisingly, in the middle of the malware ecosystem and has the most callbacks coming to the United States. So here I thought I would just try and break the countries up a little bit individually and compare them. So I just took the level of broadband connectivity, which is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis the C2 server rank, right? So I just compared them, and what you can see roughly is a general correlation between connectivity and malware. But, of course, each country is a bit unique here. And so Luxembourg, for example, has a bigger malware problem than Lebanon. It may be because Luxembourg has a lot of money and is a banking center. Virgin Islands has a bigger problem than French Polynesia, etc. If you notice, though, down at the far left bottom of the graph, China and the US has the most malware servers in the world, and China now is the most connected country in the world, with the most people connected to the internet. So move on here, and I did promise to draw you a new map of planet Earth based on malware. So here you can see this was interesting enough that it made the cut in the slides. This is just broken up on the right. You see the equator, so that's latitude. Almost all the C2 servers in the world are above the equator. So the little red boxes in this graph, they are based on vertical and country. So if you blew them up, you would see France, legal, India, insurance. But the location on the graph is determined by the C2 server location. So you can see almost all C2 servers are located above the equator. So if you're an investigator, you're a law enforcement investigator, you're going to stay primarily in the northern hemisphere. On the left side, that's the prime meridian running through Greenwich, England. And you can still see that most of malware servers are to the right of the prime meridian. And then the United States dominates most of what's in west of that on this graph. Now, if you just look at callbacks generally speaking around the world from all of our clients, we just drop that into a word cloud. Where are the callbacks going? And in this graph, you can clearly see that most callbacks are going to the United States, which is really interesting. I mean, first of all, maybe it means that the United States is not doing all it can to mitigate this threat and to manage malware. But that's not the end of the story. I mean, the United States has the most computers connected to the internet. We have a lot of intellectual property to steal. We have a free market philosophy, and we're at the center of the internet. We're the home of the internet. So this is also not surprising. But it's still true that everybody's calling back to the United States. And so from a certain perspective, you also think that that gives American law enforcement, counterintelligence, and foreign intelligence agencies opportunities, right? More visibility on what's going on around the world if you're sitting where you can see it, right? Because you have to be able to see something to recognize it, and so this is interesting. And I don't know all that it means. You can come up with your own conclusions about that. But in 2013, according to FireEye data, the U.S. was home to 24.1%, so about a quarter of the world's malware traffic resolved by IP. So here's a large smattering of our clients from around the world, and you can see here, these are all unique callbacks. And so what I really look for in the data, you hear people say, well, we were attacked 10 million times last year. What I'm looking for is a more reliable number, are unique communications, right? And so that's why the number here caps at 3,000. But I'm trying to look for unique callbacks. But still, the point of this graph is that most of our clients around the world, their top callback destination, individually speaking, not just collectively, but individually, is the United States, right? All of the top, for this graph, callback destinations is the United States. But there are some differences out there, and also on this slide, what I'd like to highlight is this interesting point of calling back within your own country in order to lessen the level of suspicion, perhaps on the part of network administrators or security personnel. Because, if you're a hacker in Russia or China and you're targeting the Pentagon, you might want to take the data out through Iowa or Wisconsin rather than straight back to Russia, right? Because I promise you, network security personnel, they're going to look through their logs and they're going to be looking for suspicious connections, right? And so the more advanced attacker you are, the more you're going to try and obfuscate your traffic and anonymize your communications. So in this sense, pulling data back through the country of the victim, it may be an important consideration. And you can see here for South Korea, actually, about half of all callbacks stay within South Korea. Now, maybe the victims and the aggressors are both in the same country, but in this case, about half stay within Korea. Now, mind you, I want to reemphasize at this point that these are just the first stage callbacks, right? So it's a compromised machine calling back to its C2 server. Now, that's not the location of the attacker, or the true source of the attack. This could be, but it wouldn't be a very smart hacker. And I assume there's some kind of a scale, that the most advanced hackers are going to be the most difficult to catch and to follow. But still, I talked recently to a really advanced intrusion analyst in the States who said that there are a lot of countries, and he named China, and he said that groups, they just they don't have as much time as you think to obfuscate their communications, and they always have other IPs that they can use, and so more often than you realize, they bring traffic straight back to their home country. But however, in this case, beyond Korea, you can see so many countries where from South Korea, the computers are calling back to. Second is the United States. Then you have China, Germany, Netherlands, and Russia on down. And of course, if you get down in the lower right-hand corner of the graph, the boxes get very, very, very small. And as Dan Gear pointed out yesterday, the big players on the internet will tell you that there's a certain percentage of their traffic that these are unknown protocols and very difficult to analyze from any standpoint. So you can dig down into this network chart and you can isolate certain nodes and see how unique or common they are. I just took China and Russia here. So here are callbacks to China and Russia, and you can see that from an investigator's standpoint, it's going to be really hard because they're almost unique. They're almost the same. You only have a number of countries that are reporting back to each that are unique. But you can start to dig down into that. For example, going back to Russia, you see several countries, Lithuania, Hungary, Bulgaria, that were within the former Soviet sphere of influence, or Russia's backyard. Right? So this is the kind of thing, even a high-level strategic analysis, if you color these dots, and I will in a second, you can see certain countries that have either a geographical or a logical connection to the victim, right? And then you can blow those up and isolate the traffic. But in general, from this slide, what you can see is it truly is a worldwide malware ecosystem, and for many countries, the majority of data is going to be quite the same. So here's Russia, callbacks to Russia, and just like I pointed out, the United States is home to almost everyone else's callbacks first on the list. It's also the same in the opposite direction. So I just isolated callbacks to Russia, and you can see here that the United States is over 10 times higher than the second place country, Canada or Korea, in terms of callbacks that we saw going to malware servers in Russia. So it works both ways, and it really, again, highlights the centrality of the United States in terms of the world's malware infrastructure going both directions, whether it's callbacks out of the States or to the States. But you can see here, though, callbacks to Russia are primarily come from the United States. So here's Israel. I highlighted Israel traffic, and then here I'm looking at both directions. So on the right side, these are countries. Now, mind you, there's a lot of communications within these individual edges that are between the nodes. But these are just the countries only. But these are the countries that were receiving callbacks from Israel. And then on the right side, it's the countries that were uniquely calling back to Israel. And then the circle in the middle are countries that were doing both, right? And so to some degree, this is going to be part of the world's malware infrastructure that is impossible to decipher, and there may be no logic to it. But there also may be some logic to it. Like for instance, if you look on the left side, the countries that are colored red, they have both a logical and a geographical connection to Israel in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So that's a relatively small number. If you get in the middle, it's a higher number, the countries that are calling both to and from Israel. And then if you get on the right, the countries that are uniquely calling to Israel, it's the highest percentage, right? So there's only about 9 or 10 here, but roughly 40% of them, right, are in the Middle East and are part of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And they're calling uniquely back to Israel. So this is the kind of analysis that you can do, even if you don't know what any of these individual communications are, but you have access to large net flow data. Right? It's not just net flow, this is malware flow, right? So these aren't Google searches, these are malware callbacks. And so these are of much higher concern than just a bump in Google traffic, let's say. Enough on that. Here I have 2 case studies I think that we'll close with before we talk about question and answer we may have. But in this case, what I wanted to see with 30 million callbacks, I assumed that you could absolutely see reflections of geopolitical activity, military operations, elections, natural disasters, you name it, but especially events that are close to national security, right? The closer, the better. So in this case, I have 2 events I'd like to discuss with you. One is the Ukraine crisis, and one is the Israeli invasion of Gaza. But here's my hypothesis. It's that within this worldwide ecosystem of malware, it's hard to hide because we have so many data points, right? We have data points coming from thousands of clients to over 200 countries. Now, if your country is in the middle of an acute crisis, here's my hypothesis. You're going to have maybe a dozen or 2 dozen agencies that have national security requirements that they're trying to fill, right? And so your country is on the verge of war or is about to be invaded, right? You're going to be levied with a number of these requirements that you're trying to fulfill them. And so to some degree, you are going to fulfill those requirements through computer network operations, through hacking, right? And so, again, this is high-level analysis. It's kind of like the pizza delivery trucks to the Pentagon, or there's another case during World War II I read about in the BBC last year. And this is called traffic analysis, and you don't have to know who the sender is by name or what is in the communication in order to be able to do traffic analysis. All you need is to know frequency of communication, volume of communication, and direction of communication. So for example, in World War II, there was just doing traffic analysis, we saw that there was some extremely interesting communications going to this obscure port in Norway. So we didn't know what was there, the Allies didn't, but they figured it was really important just based on traffic analysis, so they bombed it anyway. And it turned out that they were right. It was a super secret torpedo factory, right? But we had no way of knowing that except based on really strategic and broad-scale analysis of traffic, many points of traffic. So in this case, we took these 30 million callbacks, and we said, so here's, I think it's maybe 16 months of them or something. And so I said, for the Ukraine crisis, what I want to see, I just want to stack the countries where the IPs resolve to from malware communications. And so you can see that the US is always number 1, South Korea or Germany is always number 2. But what you saw in the run-up to the crisis in Ukraine was a rise in both Russia and Ukraine in terms of receiving malware callbacks. My own interpretation on this is that okay, for any given communication, I can't promise you that it was the super secret intelligence agency reaching out to run an operation. But I'm pretty sure that a certain percentage of this traffic is exactly that, right? They are running computer network operations to fulfill requirements in support of a national security requirement that is necessary because they're in the middle of a crisis, in the middle of a war. Right? So for both countries, you saw a rise, and at the highest peak ever was in March. And in March 2014, that was the same month that the troops in Russia were on the border threatening to invade, that Russia annexed Crimea, that the West sanctioned senior officials in Russia, that Gazprom threatened to cut off the supply of gas to Ukraine, etc. So both countries are involved in a crisis. And I'm not just picking on these countries. I think for any country, you would see this same kind of activity. You know, if the United States or China or Japan or South Africa were about to go to war, you would also see a bump in callbacks. It's just a strategic traffic analysis of high-level data when you have access to a lot of net flow data points. So for Russia-Ukraine, it was really interesting that it really was all verticals in all countries almost. It was really hard to find anything in particular. I couldn't believe really the rise. If you look at our paper, we do have a paper that we're publishing with this, both hopefully through Black Hat and FireEye. And we have a co-author, if I didn't mention that earlier, Abhishek Pidwa, and he's also our third co-author on that paper, and we get into a little bit more detail on it. But I tried to normalize the data, and I tried to cross-examine our conclusions so that we didn't have a result here that was preconceived and unwarranted. But basically, with the Russia-Ukraine event, we saw pretty much all verticals and pretty much all countries were involved in the rise, which told me that hackers are probably able to spread their communications out over a wide variety of networks in countries in order to stay low, or in order to fly low and under the radar. So for Israel-Gaza, I needed to duplicate that result from Russia-Ukraine because that was just one possibility. But you really do think, you need a lot of data to look at, and two, I think you need an acute national security crisis, right, in order to see the bump in malware callbacks. So just a couple weeks ago, right, I asked for the data for the Middle East for the last 6 months. And what I saw was, indeed, there was a bump in July in callbacks to Israel. And it's the same interpretation from my standpoint. You've got a crisis, and you have people trying to resolve that crisis through human intelligence, signals intelligence, and now you have cyber intelligence that is just part and parcel of today's political, military undertakings. And I think this is the last slide in our presentation. And basically, so this is different from the result from Russia-Ukraine, in which I saw, all verticals in all countries. With the callbacks to Israel, really, I could isolate them to the United States and to Canada. So I think, a lone hacker groups, nation states, somehow you could isolate this traffic in Israel to a particular part of the world, and that's our part of the world, United States and Canada. But in particular, Canada, if you look at the difference here, now this is numerous verticals. However, these are unique callbacks, right? So the number might look low to you, but these, in fact, they're not all the beacons. They're just unique callbacks. In other words, there was a client, a victim, and a particular malware family that was calling back. And for me, that's one. That counts as one in my own mind as an analyst. But from Canada to Israel, during this 3-month time span, in May, we only found one unique callback going from Canada to Israel. In June, we found 2, but in July, we found 18. And again, this to me supports that hypothesis as evidence pointing toward the conclusion, essentially, that computer network operations, i.e. hacking, are used today by nation states and organizations that have the wherewithal to do so to fulfill political, military requirements in support of a national agenda. So that's our presentation, and I think if we have time left, we're happy to take questions either now or later. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.